The Steelers are standing at a crossroads that this franchise rarely reaches, and everything happening right now feels heavier because of what just ended and what comes next. With Mike Tomlin no longer leading the organization, Pittsburgh is deep into a head coaching search that already tells us a lot about how the Rooney family and the front office are thinking about the immediate future versus the long-term direction of the team. One of the most eye-catching developments is that Mike McCarthy is not just loosely connected to this process, but is actively considered a strong candidate, to the point where he withdrew himself from the Tennessee Titans job to focus entirely on Pittsburgh. That alone should tell Steelers fans this is not smoke without fire. According to reports cited in the file, McCarthy is focused on the Steelers job, has turned down other inquiries, and is preparing for an in-person interview in Pittsburgh, which immediately elevates him into the serious contender category, whether fans like it or not. Once you start pulling on that thread, it becomes clear why this possibility is being discussed behind closed doors. Mike McCarthy is a Pittsburgh native, someone who grew up around this organization and understands what this job represents to the city and to the fan base. That matters more to the Steelers than it does to most franchises. Stability, familiarity, and the ability to command a locker room without culture shock are traits the Rooney family has always valued. McCarthy checks those boxes, and he also brings something else that cannot be ignored in the current context: a direct connection to Aaron Rodgers. The file makes it clear that this is not speculation built out of thin air. There is a belief around the league that if the Steelers want to maximize their chances of bringing Aaron Rodgers back for the 2026 season, hiring his former head coach gives them their strongest possible pitch. Inside the Steelers' own building, the appetite for a Rodgers return is real. Exit meetings revealed that players were overwhelmingly supportive of bringing him back. According to the information laid out, almost all players praised Rodgers during those meetings, and his support in the locker room was described as universal. He was viewed as beloved and respected, and while Rodgers himself has not committed to retiring or returning, the decision of who becomes the next head coach is expected to factor heavily into what he chooses to do. When you pair that with the reality of a weak upcoming quarterback market, the logic behind exploring continuity becomes clearer. Rodgers just led the Steelers to their first division championship in half a decade, and from an organizational standpoint, it is easy to understand why running it back feels like a safer option than starting over at the most important position in sports. That context explains why McCarthy's name refuses to go away. From a resume standpoint, he is not an empty candidate. He has over 60% career win percentage, multiple double-digit win seasons, 11 career playoff wins, experience in 22 playoff games, and a Super Bowl championship on his record. His teams are almost always in contention, something Art Rooney too has openly valued for years. Offensively, while McCarthy carries the label of being old school, the file points out that his scheme evolved in Dallas. He shifted from a traditional West Coast shotgun approach to a more modern progression-based spread offense, and the results were tangible. DaK Prescott had an MVP-caliber season in 2023, and CeeDee Lamb put together a monster year as the focal point of that offense. From a purely schematic perspective, the Steelers would not be stepping into something archaic if McCarthy were hired. But this is where the conversation with fans becomes complicated, because the positives are inseparable from the concerns. The same file lays out why many around the Steelers community are uneasy with this direction. McCarthy's recent playoff history is a major red flag. He was fired in Dallas, largely because his teams were getting eliminated early and often, sometimes in blowout fashion. For a fan base that just lived through years of first-round playoff frustration, the idea of replacing Mike Tomlin with what feels like an offensive version of the same profile is difficult to swallow. Game management issues have followed McCarthy throughout his career, especially because he prefers to call his own plays. Clock management, challenges, and situational decisions have repeatedly been criticized. And discipline has been another recurring problem, with his teams frequently ranking among the most penalized in the league. There is also the question of longevity. At 62 years old, McCarthy does not fit the traditional Steelers mold of hiring a coach they believe can lead the franchise for the next decade or more. That naturally raises doubts about whether this would be a bridge hire designed to squeeze out a final championship window with veteran players rather than a true reset. Add in the uncertainty surrounding who he would hire as defensive coordinator, especially with top options unavailable, and it becomes clear why this potential hire creates such a divided reaction. All of this is unfolding while the Steelers continue to interview other candidates and navigate the emotional aftermath of Tomlin's departure, which itself may not be permanent according to league insiders. But right now, the spotlight is firmly on what the Steelers are prioritizing in this moment: continuity versus modernization, short-term competitiveness versus long-term reinvention. The fact that Mike McCarthy is this involved in the process tells us the organization is at least seriously considering a path that keeps the current core together and makes a strong push to bring Aaron Rodgers back for another run. So, with all of that laid out, knowing what McCarthy represents, what Rodgers represents, and what this moment means for the future of the Pittsburgh Steelers, do you believe this is the right direction for the franchise, or does it feel like playing it too safe at the wrong time? The other side of this conversation, and the part that cannot be ignored, is how the Steelers are weighing alternatives at the exact same time Mike McCarthy's name continues to gain traction. Brian Flores being back in Pittsburgh for an in-person interview is not a courtesy meeting. This is a coach who has already been in the building, who coached linebackers under Mike Tomlin, and who now comes in with a reputation as one of the most respected defensive minds in football. According to the information in the file, Flores is viewed as a serious contender, and the reaction from Minnesota Vikings fans alone tells you how valuable he is. They are openly hoping Pittsburgh does not take him away, because they have watched what his system has done for that defense over multiple seasons. What makes that even more impressive is that Flores achieved elite results without relying on a roster full of superstar defenders, elevating players like Andrew Van Ginkel and Jonathan Greenard into top-tier contributors within his scheme. From a Steelers perspective, that matters. Pittsburgh has always prided itself on defensive identity, adaptability, and maximizing talent through structure and coaching. Flores represents modernization on that side of the ball without sacrificing physicality or aggression. The biggest question surrounding him, and one that fans constantly bring up, is offense. The file makes it clear that the narrative claiming Flores has no offensive connections is misleading. His potential coordinator tree includes modern NFL minds, several with Minnesota ties, and even the possibility of bringing in Antoine Randall Elko, a Steelers legend now working closely with Ben Johnson in Chicago. That alone would represent a philosophical shift toward a more progressive offensive approach, something many fans feel this franchise desperately needs after years of stagnation.
When you compare that vision to Mike McCarthy, the contrast becomes sharper. McCarthy offers familiarity, experience, and a clear path to keeping Aaron Rodgers in Pittsburgh for another year. Flores offers uncertainty at quarterback but promises structural evolution, defensive dominance, and a new voice leading the locker room. The Steelers are essentially choosing between two different types of risk. One is the risk of standing still, trusting veterans, and hoping experience wins out before time runs out. The other is the risk of change, trusting that a modern staff and new energy can elevate the roster even if it means short-term growing pains. This internal tension is visible in the interview schedule itself. Flores already completed his in-person interview. McCarthy's is set next. Anthony Weaver is also scheduled to interview, and while names like Chris Shula and Nate Shilhasa remain in the broader conversation, the file suggests that Flores and McCarthy are the two candidates generating the strongest reactions, both inside and outside the building. That is not accidental. One represents continuity and calculated comfort. The other represents a clean break from the past while still honoring Steelers' defensive tradition. Layered on top of all this is the uncertainty around Mike Tomlin's future. Jay Glazer's report that Tomlin may be done with coaching entirely complicates the emotional side of this transition. If Tomlin never returns, the Steelers lose the possibility of future trade compensation, something that could have reshaped the draft outlook the way Sean Payton's move did for New Orleans. While there is skepticism about whether Tomlin can truly stay away from football, the organization cannot plan based on hope alone. Decisions have to be made now, and those decisions will define the next era of Steelers football. That is why this coaching search feels heavier than previous ones. This is not just about replacing a coach. It is about choosing a philosophy. Do the Steelers lean into experience, stability, and a familiar offensive structure under Mike McCarthy, potentially keeping Aaron Rodgers and extending the current competitive window by a year or two? Or do they pivot toward a younger, more aggressive, and more modern approach with Brian Flores, accepting uncertainty in exchange for long-term growth and adaptability in a league that is changing faster every season? Whatever decision is coming will ripple through the roster, the quarterback room, the draft strategy, and the identity of the team itself. This is not a hire that can be undone quietly. It will signal exactly how the Steelers see themselves right now and what they believe gives them the best chance to compete in the years ahead. And even beyond the head coaching decision itself, there's a deeper layer to all of this that Steelers fans should be paying attention to, because whoever gets this job is going to shape not just Sundays, but the entire structure of the organization. This hire will influence how the Steelers approach roster construction, how aggressive they are in free agency, how they draft, and how they manage aging veterans versus younger talent. That is why the contrast between these candidates feels so dramatic. With Mike McCarthy, you are signaling that the priority is to maximize what already exists. You are telling veterans in the locker room that the window is still open right now, that continuity matters more than reinvention, and that the organization believes experience can still carry this group where it has not been able to go in recent years. That approach naturally ties back to Aaron Rodgers. If McCarthy is hired and Rodgers returns, the offense is unlikely to change in any meaningful way. Rodgers would continue to operate with a high level of autonomy, controlling protections, checks, and tempo at the line of scrimmage. For some players, that stability is appealing. For others, especially younger offensive pieces, it raises questions about development and long-term growth. The Steelers would essentially be committing to a known ceiling and betting that execution, health, and timing align better than they have in the past. On the other hand, a hire like Brian Flores would almost certainly trigger a chain reaction. The quarterback position would be reevaluated through a different lens. The offensive staff would be built intentionally to complement Flores' defensive philosophy rather than orbit around a single veteran quarterback. Younger players would likely see expanded roles, and the team would be pushed toward adaptability rather than predictability. That path is riskier in the short term, but it may offer a clearer identity in a league that increasingly punishes teams that fail to evolve. What makes this moment uncomfortable for a lot of fans is that there is no perfect answer. McCarthy brings credibility, experience, and a clear plan for the immediate future, but also baggage that feels eerily familiar. Flores brings innovation, respect, and upside, but also uncertainty that can be difficult for a franchise built on patience and stability. The Steelers are being forced to choose between two versions of themselves, and whichever choice they make will define how this era is remembered. This is why the fan reaction matters more than usual. This is not a cosmetic decision. This is not about winning a press conference. This is about whether the Steelers believe their best football is still ahead with the core they have now, or whether it is time to accept that a new foundation needs to be built, even if that road is uncomfortable at first. There's also a financial and strategic layer to this decision that rarely gets talked about, but it sits quietly underneath everything the Steelers are doing right now. A head coach does not operate in isolation. His presence changes how aggressive the front office feels it needs to be, how much future flexibility it is willing to sacrifice, and how patient ownership expects results to be. If Mike McCarthy is hired, the message internally is that the Steelers believe they are close. Close enough to justify pushing resources forward, close enough to lean on veteran leadership, and close enough to accept that the margin for error will be thin but manageable. That mindset aligns naturally with a short-term quarterback solution, a familiar offensive structure, and a roster that is asked to win now rather than grow together. That type of approach can work, but it requires near-perfect alignment. Health becomes critical, chemistry becomes critical, and the moment something goes wrong, whether it is an injury, a regression, or a late-season collapse, there is very little room to pivot. The organization would be all in on a direction that does not allow for many mid-course corrections. That is the unspoken risk of choosing continuity at this stage. By contrast, a hire like Brian Flores subtly resets expectations without announcing a full rebuild. It gives the Steelers cover to reevaluate certain contracts, to prioritize scheme fits over name recognition, and to build layers of depth rather than relying heavily on star power. It also recenters the identity of the team around defense in a way that feels familiar to Pittsburgh fans, but modern in execution. Flores' defenses are aggressive, unpredictable, and adaptable, qualities that have become increasingly valuable in a league dominated by quarterback play and spacing concepts. Another factor that matters here is leadership style. McCarthy is known as a steady, veteran presence, someone players respect but do not necessarily fear. Flores carries a reputation for intensity, accountability, and demanding buy-in from everyone in the building. Neither approach is inherently better, but they resonate differently depending on where a roster is in its life cycle. A veteran-heavy team may prefer the calm authority of experience. A younger or transitioning roster may benefit from a sharper edge and a clearer hierarchy. And then there is the weight of history. The Steelers do not churn through head coaches. Every hire carries an expectation of longevity, even if the reality does not always match. That history makes this decision feel heavier, because fans understand this is not just about 2026 or 2020.